What do you call 10,000 lawyers at the bottom of the ocean? A good start. What do you call 25 lawyers buried up to their neck in cement? Not enough cement. How many lawyer jokes are there? 3. The rest are true stories. Lawyers get a bad rap. There are hundreds of lawyer jokes that circulate and recirculate through the United States, and they usually involve a negative view of the profession. My guess is that people don't really have the patience to argue about things that they think are self-evident, like the definition of words. One famous example is when then-President Bill Clinton was being questioned about his alleged infidelity with a woman and said, quote, "There's nothing going on between us." It turned out there was a prior relationship, and when people accused him of lying, he responded, "It depends on what the definition of is." Many people said that this was a lawyer's answer. Debaters also get a bad rap, and for much the same reason. It is all too often that debates focus on the definition of terms, thereby making any arguments about the substance of a topic impossible. Unfortunately, language isn't a perfect medium for communicating ideas. Words have a way of being interpreted in very different ways. Arguments reflect this reality, so debaters have developed a position that addresses the conflict that arises over definitions, and it is called topicality. The focus of this lesson is to explain the stock issues of a topicality position. There are 4: counterdefinition, violation, standards, and impacts. If you're going to have a debate about definitions, it makes sense to explicitly lay 2 definitions side by side and compare the benefits of each. This leads to the first stock issue of topicality, counterdefinition. This issue is just as it sounds. You supply a counter-definition for one or more words from the resolution or topic from the debate. In fact, it is common practice to name the entire topicality position after the word that you are counter-defining. Let's work with one example resolution throughout this lesson. The United States should increase its constructive engagement with Cuba. This was an actual resolution in the past, and some people complained about the vagueness of the term constructive engagement at the time. So I think it makes for a good example. If I were on the opposition, I would look up the term's history in order to get a better understanding and discover what this term was used to describe using economic incentives rather than sanctions to influence the policies of foreign governments. So instead of withholding trade as a punishment for oppression, we would increase trade to encouragement of reducing oppression. So the first point on the constructive engagement topicality would be that the, quote, "The definition of constructive engagement is the relaxing of trade restrictions for the expressed purpose of improving human rights." This definition is still vague, but there is one detail that it introduces, that of trade. Basically, the negative is trying to find a predictable definition in order to aid in opposition research. This definition helps because now research can be limited to the effects of trade, rather than just any and all types of engagement. Notice that it is not required that you define things word for word. In this case, I treat constructive engagement as a single term and offer one definition. Defining them separate, I might have a completely different interpretation, creating a completely different debate. Defining terms in a resolution is virtually a necessity, regardless of whether or not there is a debate about definitions. But it is especially important to have definitions prepared if the affirmative team interprets the resolution in a way you didn't anticipate. This leads to the second stock issue of topicality, the violation. This point argues that the affirmative's interpretation violates the counter-definition. In other words, the affirmative's interpretation and the negative's interpretation are incompatible. To support this argument, negative debaters need to quote from the first affirmative constructive. There needs to be things that were said in that speech that prove the violation. Let's work with a previous example. The resolution is, the U.S. should increase constructive engagement with Cuba. The affirmative approaches the podium, thanks the audience and judges, and begins to explain that they interpret the resolution to mean that they need to engage Cuba in order to construct a democratic nation. Therefore, they conclude that the affirmative will defend the invasion of Cuba. It is easy to see how this interpretation is incompatible with the counter definition discussed earlier. All of the supposed advantages that the affirmative would argue are based on military action rather than economic action. Notice that the dispute isn't that the affirmative has presented a case that isn't debatable. There is ample reason to conclude that invading Cuba is a bad idea. Topicality merely argues that their interpretation violates the meaning of the term from the resolution. This point of the topicality position is hard to prepare because it only exists once the affirmative has spoken. Therefore, listening is very important. Furthermore, thinking of questions that clarify the affirmative's position might be helpful. For example, how is this invasion going to affect our economic trade with Cuba? Or even more direct, is economic trade with Cuba part of this invasion? The answers to these questions are the evidence that you can use in the second point of your topicality position. The affirmative violates the definition of constructive engagement when they answer my question by saying that the invasion halts all trade with Cuba. It is tempting to conclude that you have won the debate once you are able to show that the affirmative's interpretation violates your counter definition, but that is really just the beginning. Now you have to explain why the judge should conclude that the negative definition is superior to the affirmative definition. This brings up the stock issue of standards. Standards are reason why the negative's interpretation is the best interpretation of the terms in the resolution. Simply saying that that's just what the words mean is not enough to win topicality. Words have several interpretations, and the only thing that the violation proves is that the interpretations are different, not that either is better. Essentially, this means that if you began a sentence with, "Our definition is better than theirs because," then anything that logically completes that sentence is a standard. There are some common standards. Perhaps the most helpful standard for the constructive engagement topicality is that of field contextuality. Field context means that the term in question has a particular meaning when used in a particular field of study. In other words, in the context of foreign relations, constructive engagement has consistently been used to describe liberal economic policies and has stood in stark contrast to military options. Another common standard is grammar, that grammatically the negative has a more accurate interpretation than the affirmative. For the Cuba topic, the negative might identify constructive engagement as a compound term, kind of like Attorney General refers to a specific job title in the government and not just a generic lawyer. Grammatically, the word constructive modifies the word engagement to create a very specific meaning. There are many other common standards that debaters use in competition. The standard of ground argues that the negative's definitions are better because it preserves debatable ground for both sides. Framers' intent argues that the negative's definition is in line with what the writers of the resolution intended the debate to be about. Predictability argues that the negative's interpretation is a more predictable interpretation and results in higher quality research and preparation. But you can create standards if you are able to articulate any reason why one definition is better than the other. It is typically best if there is an easy 1 or 2 word title in order to reference the standard throughout the topicality position. It increases how memorable the standard is, so in rebuttals the judges are able to recall your reasoning. The final stock issue is that of impacts. This point includes an explanation about what the consequences ought to be for an affirmative that provides a faulty interpretation. One common argument is that the topicality is an a priori issue. This means that determining whether or not the affirmative presented a topical case must be decided prior to evaluating the pros and cons of that case. The reason is that if the judge determines the affirmative presented a case that doesn't support the resolution, then he or she can't reasonably conclude that the affirmative won the debate. The one and only responsibility of the affirmative is to prove the resolution true. It doesn't matter if they can research the advantages on a different topic, they must successfully argue in favor of the topic that both teams were assigned. So the affirmative might have great reasons for military engagement with Cuba, but they haven't presented reasons for constructive engagement. In short, the a priori impact says that if the affirmative loses the topicality argument, the judge doesn't even need to look at the case in order to render a verdict. Another common impact is simply that topicality is a voter. This means that the affirmative cannot ignore this issue. If they do, then it is an automatic win for the negative. Some of the justification for this argument are the same as the a priori impact that I just explained, that the affirmative has one job: support the resolution. One last common impact is that of the prima facie burden. This means that the affirmative must be topical on face, or in the first speech. This argument prevents the second affirmative from coming up in the following speech and offering topical arguments and just saying, "Our bad, ignore that first speech." While I don't think that would be a persuasive strategy in the long run, technically one could make logical arguments why that is permissible. The prima facie impact is the negative, nipping that argument in the bud and forcing the affirmative to rely on, and only on, arguments articulated in the first affirmative to prove that they are topical. All of these impacts point to one thing. That is, the affirmative loses topicality, they lose everything. At this point, I think you see why topicality has become such a prevalent argument in competitive debate. It is extremely potent. The negative might have no good arguments against the affirmative's case, but have one well-structured topicality position and theoretically still win. After learning the four stock issues to topicality, the counter definition, violation, standards, and impacts, perhaps you see why some people look at topicality in much the same way they perceive lawyers, as people who bicker about definitions rather than the issues. But hopefully you also see why topicality is useful. Sometimes the affirmative team presents a case that doesn't directly support the topic, and expecting the negative to be prepared for every debate in the world seems unfair. Topicality is a structured way to articulate that point, but sometimes people abuse this position by always arguing about definitions and avoiding the substance. If you happen to become this type of debater, don't be surprised if people joke that 10,000 topicality debaters at the bottom of the ocean sounds like a good start.